stuff too. So welcome and thanks so much for taking the time. I'm so excited to talk to you about Jiu-Jitsu history today.
Thank you for having me, Jeff. It's a pleasure. It's been, almost 2 years now, at least a year and a half. And time flies. We've been working hard. A lot has happened since. But I'm excited to be here. And yeah, let's talk some Jiu-Jitsu history and whatever else comes up.
Terrific. I'm really I'm going to try to do stuff that both serves people that are new to the story of Jiu-Jitsu history and also some of us nerds that have been following you along on this journey for, as you said, a few years now. So let's start with the Orthodox version of Jiu-Jitsu history that most students hear when they go into their academy. The sort of Orthodox version is Mitsuyo Maeda, who, a Kodokan judoka, came to Brazil, taught Carlos Gracie, taught his brother Elio, and Elio modified the techniques with the leverage from his own experience and founded Gracie Jiu-Jitsu. Now, like most stories, it's more complicated than that, right? And so one of the cool things about following your journey is even the original research you're posting on Instagram and sharing with us now, even before the film comes out, is stuff that nobody's really seen before, at least not for decades. And so what can you tell us about how that Orthodox version of history came to be and what some of the figures that we don't hear about as much in that story, what their contributions were?
Yeah, so the problem with any history, right, is that if it's not challenged immediately, it gains like a body of its own. It becomes, the older it is and the longer it goes without being questioned, the holier it becomes, right? The more sacred, and the less you can question it, because clearly, if it has survived 100 years of scrutiny, right, then clearly all those people have accepted it. Cannot be wrong. We associate, truth with democracy. It's interesting. We associate these things. If a lot of people believe something, well, clearly it must be the truth. For ignoring that 500 years ago, many people believed the earth was flat. Ironically, some people today still do, but but for the most part, people are wrong all the time. So just because a lot of people believe something, it doesn't make that they're right. But in the case of Jiu-Jitsu history, the problem was, no one in Brazil actually, took the time to actually, look into it. I mean, there were some people that looked into it. Other Stanley Virgílio, one, you get this guy in the Amazon, Brazil, Rio do Eros de Medeiros, and Fábio Takao and Marcial. And then there's some guys that done some research prior to the digitizing, but there wasn't much available, right? The digitizing of the National Library really changed everything because they made all these files available. Like the one person that did like some very in-depth research on the history of Jiu-Jitsu in Brazil in a very academic way was Tufi, who I know you had on your podcast. And what he did was like very old school, right? The hard way. Like you go through the files physically, hand and nail, and you go through one by one in the archives and you find what's relevant. And just imagine the amount of files you got to dig through to be able to find something that's going to be helpful. And, with the digitizing of the files, it's almost like a Google search engine. So it's a lot easier to find information, and it has made the job of a historian a lot easier in a lot of ways. But, regarding the narrative, it's been unquestioned for a long time. And that's, I think that's one of probably the biggest challenge we have is how do we challenge something that has been unchallenged for so long? Of course, it's ironic that people in Brazil, when you tell them that there's another narrative to the history of BJJ, no one bats an eyelash. Everyone thinks, oh, yeah, of course there is. Like it's very people that there's no one on a pedestal the way, the average Brazilian sees this story. Whereas the people who, in the United States, because for whatever reason, they've absorbed that narrative a lot more than Brazilians have. It's a lot harder to get through their head that what they have been hearing for the last 20 plus years is not necessarily accurate, right? There's a lot more to the story. But it's an enormous effort. There's a lot of cool work out there. We mentioned Tufi. Choque by Roberto Pedreira is probably my favorites in real depth. He has a new book out called Craze that talks about Jiu-Jitsu prior to the formation of Kodokan, during the formation of Kodokan, and then briefly after, right? It's a period that Choque doesn't really touch on. Choque is mostly centered around what's going on in Brazil. Craze more what's going on in Japan. So it's a prequel, really. It's even better, if you ask me. I like Craze even more than Choque. Highly recommended. If you read Portuguese, Marcial Serrano has some really cool books. Many of the same sources already used in Choque. slightly different interpretations, less academically oriented. Elton Silva, okay, just came out with a really cool book about the history of MMA in Brazil. Also like really worth reading. He recently found a picture of Luis França, which is pretty cool. We're going to use that in the documentary. Yeah, so some really cool stuff out there, man. We really, we're living a renaissance of BJJ history. Like this wasn't going on 10 years ago. This is something fairly new, and it came at the right time because people have never been so interested in their roots. I feel that this wasn't really something that was coming up in conversation 15 years ago, 10 years ago. Now everyone's always trying to find out more about it. I think people are a little exhausted of just professional jiu-jitsu competitions and BJJ gossip. I think that the BJJ community and the martial arts community in general, they're ready for something a little more, a little more intellectual, a little more, let's give this some thought. Let's analyze this with an eye in human psychology, with an eye in the philosophy of martial arts, with an eye in history and telling history accurately. Let's move away from the soap opera aspect of BJJ.
I agree with all of that, especially the renaissance of BJJ history, which is very exciting for those of us that love the art. And because you mentioned Luis França, let's talk a little bit about the untold stories around the origin of jiu-jitsu, because everybody loves a simple story, right? It's less to remember. It's like this one guy taught this one guy, then he taught everybody. But not only was Maeda not the only Japanese who is barnstorming and teaching, but certainly the Gracies were not the only students at that time learning from Maeda. And so guys like Donato Pires dos Reis, and I'm going to apologize for butcher pronunciation.
That was pretty good, actually. That was good.
Appreciate that. That's good to hear. Jacinto Ferro, for example. And so what like early names should people know that they don't know?
The conversation about lineage is one that we all obsess over. Like, lineages are so important to us, and they don't say much about anything when you really get down to it. Like, lineages are totally arbitrary. You don't really learn from one person. Anyone who knows anything about learning knows that you're learning from your training partners. You're learning from a variety of experiences. Your coach is just one of those experiences, even though he's, coach is the one that keeps a tight ship and keeps everything working. Like, the role of a coach or of a teacher is far more important than just teaching you jiu-jitsu. That's what people don't get. But there's a lot of characters, and I normally I've been describing BJJ history recently as not as a linear motion, because that linear top down, kind of idea of Jigoro Kano, Maeda, Carlos Gracie, it's very simplistic. It's almost cartoonish. That's how I describe it. It's almost like, it's something you would use that sort of analysis to explain BJJ to children, but if we're adults and we're going to be serious about the discussion, our linear interpretation is not really straight. It's really like a bush, it intertwines with other events, and they're all relevant, and it's not so simple. To begin with, I learned this recently. Kano never taught Maeda.
Yeah,
it was believed that Tokuguro Ito and I think Yamashita had taught Maeda, and they never did either. I just found out on Pajero's website a while ago. He released a really cool article about the top 20 myths regarding Maeda, and then he mentions, I can't remember, 3 or 4 Japanese who taught Maeda, and you never heard of them. I haven't heard of them either. So, but this is the importance of serious research, because you correct misconceptions. Most people believe Kano was Maeda's coach. Maeda was a student of the Kodokan, but Kano was not teaching at that time, right? So we know who Maeda's coaches were, and they're newly introduced characters. We're going to try to mention them in the documentary. We're not sure we're going to be able to. Too many people to mention. But regarding the history in Brazil, it's more complex, because, as Mehdi would say, it's all judo. And I think he was right. Like, that's the thing, that like this whole narrative, like, oh, we reinvented and brought back the old Japanese jiu-jitsu that, judo was hiding, and Hideo did rediscover jiu-jitsu or invented it. I mean, it's a great story, and Horian was brilliant for telling it. It was a brilliant marketing move. It's just not accurate, and you can make an argument that it was necessary. And if it weren't for that storytelling, I wouldn't have this job that I have. I'd be doing something else. And that's a very good argument. But in any case, it's still not accurate. What we do is modify judo. That's all we do. What we do is not Brazilian jiu-jitsu. What we do is Brazilian judo. In fact, when Brazilian jiu-jitsu became popular around the world and went back to Japan, and we got this from many Japanese, Yuki Nakai said it best, but they're basically like, why are you guys calling this jiu-jitsu? It's obviously judo. Like, why are you guys calling it jujitsu? They didn't understand why Brazilians were calling it jujitsu. Went to the Japanese, well, you guys are just doing judo with an emphasis on newaza. And that's the truth of it. Like, we're just judokas who specialize on the ground. The term jujitsu is very archaic and has very little to do with what we practice today. So, and I think a lot of people, you know, they see BJJ as a superior form to judo, like an extension or an evolution. And I think that Jigoro Kano and, you know, the official Kodokan rule set left some major holes in their game. And that's why BJJ exists. You know, I've been saying this a lot. It's a personal conclusion. Some people may disagree, but BJJ only exists because of mistakes that Jigoro Kano and the Kodokan leadership made. They left huge holes in judo. You know, you eliminate wrist lock, you eliminate foot locks, you eliminate shoulder locks, you eliminate guard pull, and you eliminate all these things. Okay, you're going to have a very takedown-oriented martial art. Fair enough. You know, think of that whatever you want. But they left a hole there. And that little void was fulfilled by Brazilians, for, you know, especially the Gracie family. And, you know, for better or for worse, whatever the case, maybe we'd be better off doing judo. I don't know. I love Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. I like ground fighting. So I like what we do. So, you know, in one way or another, we have to give thanks for them to carving out a niche outside of judo. But they didn't invent anything. Like, they deserve credit for carving that niche for a different aspect of judo to exist. They didn't invent anything. There's absolutely nothing that was invented in Brazil. The Japanese were always ahead of Brazilian until like really the mid 90s, if you ask me. But like, you know, the Brazilians were really good at a very basic, they're really good on the ground at a very basic approach to judo. But all you got to do is look at what the Kosen judokas were doing in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and they were light years ahead. In fact, they were reaching conclusions of ground grappling that Brazilians wouldn't reach until the 90s. So, you know, like when I see a De La Riva, you know, and I say this as a practitioner, as a fighter, as a coach, you don't reach that conclusion unless you spend hundreds and thousands of hours on the mats to reach the conclusion that De La Riva is an efficient way of playing open guard. So if the Japanese are reaching that conclusion in the 30s, 40s, 50s, what does that suggest to you? That there was a culture of grappling. You don't think of De La Riva and you execute it the next day. This comes from a lot of experience. So that experience was there. The experience dies out as judo becomes more and more stand-up oriented. The techniques survive over the decades. They survived, but they weren't very practiced. They had like, you know, little centers here and there that practiced it, not competitively. And Brazilians had a lot of time to focus on one aspect of judo, and they got really good at the, you know, really a very basic, simple aspect of judo. Like 70s and 80s and even up to the 90s, if you watch these guys grapple, they were good on the ground, but it was very simple in terms of sophistication. You know, it's important to draw that distinction between, you can be very skilled at something basic, like Roger Gracie, for example, and it's not better or worse. It's simple and it's very highly efficient. Or you can have something that's highly sophisticated and highly efficient, right? You can have both and they can coexist. In the case of the sophisticated, it takes a long time to reach the conclusion of a berimbolo. That does not come about in your first week of training. And I think that people need to understand that the fact that the Japanese were reaching some of these conclusions early in the 20th century is suggestive to a very grappling, ground-oriented culture in Japan.
There's a lot to chew on there, and I want to get back to the footlocks thing later, but let's talk about the distinction between jiu-jitsu and judo, or lack thereof, because some of that is technical, right? And as you say, like technically, there maybe isn't a bunch of light between what Maeda was teaching and what the Gracies ended up doing. There's also the question of emphasis and philosophy, though, and something I wanted to ask you about, because Kano is a fascinating figure to me, as is Maeda, and the naming of things was important to both of them. Kano called it judo because he saw it more, from my understanding, from John Stevens' book, as physical education, right? It's like, this is a sport that's going to help us improve our spirit. Right. And whereas Maeda was a performer who wanted to practice, who wanted to fight. And that, to my understanding, was a cause of the split, where Maeda wanted to prize fight. He wanted to, and Kano did not want the Kodokan associated with that. And so is that your understanding, or what?
Yeah, it's very accurate. Like, from my understanding, once again, like there are people that have researched this more. I always recommend Craze. Like, you want to like focus on this period. Craze is probably the best read I've ever seen in that regard. A lot of sources in Japanese, which a lot of researchers in the West completely skip. They focus on secondary sources in English and languages they speak. So it's hard to do this research, you know, in a professional manner unless you speak Japanese. So it's important to remind people of that. But, you know, Kano was in a privileged position too, because he doesn't need the money. It's easy to be a noble, you know, a moral giant when you don't need the cash. And I can say, if I'm a millionaire, I can say, I teach jujitsu for free, and jujitsu should be a means of education, you know, and it should be free for everyone. How dare you charge to teach jujitsu? It's not very noble when you have the means to sustain yourself and your family, where Maeda didn't have those means. So it's easy to judge Maeda as like someone who's sold out to, you know, professional fighting and fake fights. Most of Maeda's fights were probably fake. That's the other aspect of it. And not just Maeda, like many people in that period, they had to live. And, you know, Kano didn't like the association because he really had a vision for education. Like he wanted education, martial arts to be a vehicle of education for the masses, right? Well, a lot of the confusion comes from when Maeda leaves Japan, the term jiu-jitsu is still the most used term.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the term judo was not as popular as it would later become. You know, Kano wanted later dissociates himself the word jiu-jitsu because jiu-jitsu becomes the buzzword in the West. That's what gives title to Pedrero's book, Craze, right? Like jiu-jitsu is everywhere. Like the world is really interested in what the Japanese have. Like how can tiny Japan defeat large Russia? Clearly, these people have something that other people don't have. They must have something special about them. So that whole marketing plot of the small defeating the large was really, it starts with the Russo-Japanese War, where Japan wins, you know, unexpectedly. No one expected, you know, tiny Japan to defeat large Russia, but they win, and the Japanese use that as a marketing tool to spread jiu-jitsu around the world. Their archaic interpretation of jiu-jitsu, which at that time overlapped with Kodokan teaching. Remember, Kodokan at this time is not Kodokan, it's Kano jiu-jitsu. So when Maeda leaves Japan, what happens is he is still using the term jiu-jitsu. Other Japanese are still using the term jiu-jitsu, and they don't have means of funding themselves. So they start working in circuses. They're teaching whatever they can. They're fighting whatever they can. They're just immigrants trying to make it like everyone else. Kano doesn't like this. So he begins to insist on the term judo, which he believed was more philosophically in tune with what the vision he had for judo. Here's where the confusion begins. What Maeda was teaching and practicing was Kodokan Judo, even though when he left Japan, it was not called that, but it was Kodokan Judo. But Kodokan, not only did he have a catch wrestling experience, so he probably absorbed some elements of catch wrestling in his journeys, but also because, you know, as when Maeda leaves, the Kodokan Judo changes. It's constantly changing, still changing. Like the IBJJF, they're constantly changing the rules. And they begin to change the rules, and it becomes more and more stand-up oriented. From my understanding, Maeda was no expert on the ground. I think it's said that Maeda specialized on the ground. From my understanding, he wasn't. He specialized in takedowns, even though he probably had more experience on the ground, given that Kodokan rules become like more less ground oriented over time. You know, Yujigoro Kano was very averse to ground fighting, which is a huge misunderstanding of fighting, in my opinion. Like, I say this as a coach, as a fighter, I don't think Yujigoro Kano knew much about fighting, to be honest. I think he was an important diplomat. I think he was an important figure. I think he had a right vision of absorbing the traditional Japanese and merging that with the modernization that Japan was going through. And in that sense, he was brilliant. But in terms of fighting, I don't think he understood self-defense. I don't think he understood fighting. I think you can't say that, you know, takedowns are better for self-defense than, it's like, okay, you can make the argument multiple attackers. Still grabbing someone and throwing is a horrible idea. The best form of self-defense against multiple attackers is A, track and field, run. That's the best one. 2, boxing. I won't even say Muay Thai. You don't want to kick. You're fighting 5-6 people. You don't want to kick. You want to punch and run, right? Throwing people is not a great idea. Grappling with them isn't either. On a one-on-one case scenario, like 1 versus 1, of course the ground. Like there's no one disputes that. 1 versus 1, that's going to go to the ground eventually, especially if, like, you know, at least one of them isn't very skilled. I suspect that his values of being a gentleman and absorbing like a lot of what the West at that time perceived as how a gentleman should behave. He was very Western in a lot of ways. You got to remember that. He's only partially Japanese. His ideas are very Western oriented. A gentleman is clean. A gentleman stands upright. A gentleman does not dirty himself on the ground. His words to John Stevens, The ground is for animals. Humans walk upright. His words. So I think there was some prejudice against ground fighting. There is indication there's pressure from other within the Butokukai and even Kodokan, pressure for ground fighting. There's a famous challenge between and I don't know much about this, so I could be misquoting. So please do your own research on this one. But the Kodokan grapplers were being beaten on the ground by a school, the Fusenru school of Matainemon, and that right there was kind of like everyone, Jigoro Kano, this ground stuff kind of is important. That's where we're losing. So he keeps under pressure. I think he keeps some elements of ground fighting in judo, but you can see them increasingly becoming less and less ground oriented. Meanwhile, in Brazil, what Maeda is teaching is judo, but the term that he was most used to, that everyone was used to in the West, was still jujitsu. So it lingered in Brazil. It became the buzzword. Later, judo would grow and expand in Brazil and the world, and the judokas become assimilated by this style. The Japanese become assimilated by this style, and the term jujitsu is used less and less, with one exception. A small little niche of Brazilians, namely, the Gracie family, Luis França, and then some other some other jiu-jitsu instructors in Brazil, but they began to distance themselves from the official Kodokan rule set, and that's where the split comes. But it gets complicated because the two terms were used interchangeably for so long.
Most definitely. And so, and I think that, thank you for explaining that philosophical distinction, which I think is completely accurate. Kano was very much someone who is more important as an educator in Japan than even as a martial artist. And so that was his focus. And certainly he abhorred fighting and some things like that. So you can see how he wouldn't be as versed in self-defense. I want to highlight one little technical thing, because here's the thing, you mentioned that judo took out certain techniques, and this created a hole essentially that another martial art or other folks practicing could exploit, where it's like, okay, well, you don't teach footlocks. Okay, we can talk about this too. Like, it's interesting to me that and this kind of switching gears a little bit, and it's my understanding that for a while in Brazil, footlocks were looked down on too as lower class techniques that lower class people did. Is that not accurate?
Yeah, there's a tradition of of associating footlocks with some of the suburbs, and from my understanding, this came from the Fada camp, who was some members probably liked the footlocks, and they got good at it. They probably learned it from catch wrestlers at some point, something that survived through some Japanese travelers, and they got good at it. And this is the interesting thing about this conversation. Whatever I'm not good at is not jujitsu. Whatever I'm not good at is not real jiu-jitsu. Whatever I'm good at is real jiu-jitsu. And it's so fascinating to me how quickly people will eliminate something they don't like and disqualify it. That's not real jiu-jitsu. Oh, you won by points. That's not real jiu-jitsu, because you can't win by points. So therefore, a submission-only format is real jiu-jitsu, right? And this goes across the board, everyone. Like, oh, you didn't finish the fight, so you're not really, that's not real jiu-jitsu, And you can, if you're going to have that sort of mindset, you can distort it in any way you want. You can rationalize it. Any defeat can be justified with that sort of rationale, right? And, I suspect that a lot of the leading members of the original Guanabara Federation, and when they create the rule set, that is the foundation for IBJJF's rule set till this day, in 1967, is that they didn't understand footlocks too well. There's a lot of, they weren't good at it. So if I'm not good at it, clearly it's threatening. And Jigoro Kano makes that too, like my mistake. I suspect he was not good on the ground. Because if you're good at something, you like it and you want to emphasize it. It's when you're not good at it, oh, no, let's start on our knees. I don't like takedowns. Takedowns are dangerous. Oh, I got a bad knee. I got a bad shoulder. Let's just start on our knees. Translation, I suck standing and I don't want to lose because I have a big ego and I'd rather just go home feeling good about myself. So I'm going to start in position that I'm comfortable in. Right, and everyone everyone does this. I do it, you do it. We've all. It's an enormous effort to correct that. To admit, to ourselves that we don't actually know something. It's an enormous exercise of humility, constant and daily, of reminding ourselves that if I don't like something, it's because I'm not good at it. I hate running sprints. You know why? Because I'm not good at running sprints. It's how we are. It's how our brains are designed. We're leaning towards comfort. And I suspect this is what happened in jiu-jitsu, is that, the people who were responsible for creating the rules, they leaned towards the things that they were better at, away from takedowns, right? No penalty for guard pulling, No, let's allow, because like they couldn't beat the judoka, so let's gonna focus on the stuff that we're good at. And it was associated with the suburbs. Even when I started training, if you footlock someone on the mats, like people will throw shoes at you on the mats and make fun of you, you know. And it was a kind of like a joke. You're not supposed to footlock. And I was like, they're not illegal, are they? No, they're not. I'm like, well, what's the issue then? And you know, I think that in some ways BJJ replicates today, and then and today replicates the mistakes that Kodo Khan made in limiting grappling. And the second you limit something and you say you can't do it, you create space for something else to exist that does allow it. Of course, at some point we have to, if we're going to practice it as a sport and we're going to reach out to children, moms and dads, people who aren't professional fighters, you're going to have to set limits, and you're going to have to practice it within a framework that, you know, factors in the safety element, not only the martial element of combat. There's those two things, you know, the balance between sport and martial art. It's not an easy balance to find. I think judo made many mistakes. I think IBJJF makes some. I think submission only in their attempt largely out of resentment to carve a niche outside of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu is already making them some of those same mistakes, because they are limiting themselves, not by submission, but by disqualifying positions as important aspects of grappling. And you know, these are just my although this is, you know, at this point, it's just my interpretation of grappling as a whole rather than a historical fact. It's just my understanding of these events and how they develop.
Yeah, but I think that's largely accurate. And I think it's a really important discussion for how arts evolve. Like you already mentioned, the Kosen judoka doing what we would call a de la hiva or X-guard today, probably because those dudes spent thousands of hours on the mat. Their training partners put them in positions that required them to have an answer, and then they developed those answers sort of on their own. One thing that I wanted to mention too, or I wanted to ask you about rather, is you mentioned that even when you were training, you know, foot locks, people would throw shoes at you and people, it's a dirty move, or it's a cheap move or whatever. One figure that you and I have talked about before that gets left out of the discussion is George Gracie, who was arguably, you know, one of the more important Gracies that doesn't get talked about, who was doing footlocks and doing all kinds of fights, and in fact had a series with Yano that Tufi talks about in his dissertation, where he finishes Yano once with a footlock. And so are you going to get into George much in the documentary?
Yeah, I honestly, I don't know much about George's style of fighting. From my understanding and based off of what I know, like he had a more open style than Helio. Helio would like close, lock, draw. If I finish, you great. If I don't, it's a draw. If I drew it, really won. George would lose a lot more than Helio. He would also fight a lot more, but he had a more loosened, like, it was more entertaining to watch, is what we got from a lot of the people who had, a lot of the grandmasters who had witnessed them fight. Like his style was more dynamic. But George's, we're definitely going to talk about him, and I always mention George. It's important, and I use him kind of like a no. This is a neutral documentary, because the original, I think, assertion that people make when we talk about a documentary that's going to help retell the history of Jiu-Jitsu, they assume by default it's an anti-Gracie piece, right? Because clearly the narrative is Gracie, so anything that disagrees with it is anti-Gracie, and we never wanted to do that. That's not the case. Just because you are going to, you know, correct some of the Gracie narrative does not mean you're anti-Gracie. And I think it's important to not fall into this binary interpretation of history, which is very destructive. It prevents people from understanding history as a whole, and it turns history into a matter of teams. This is not football. This is not politics. This is history. There's not one side or two or 10 for that matter. There are many, many facts, and you have to interpret them all if you want to get to something close to the truth. In history, you don't really touch it. You just gravitate around. The truth is not something you get to in historical terms. But there's a, you know, George is important because, you know, he's one of the heroes of our story. And he's an important character because he is the first Gracie hero. He is the first, like, remember, Carlos was not a good fighter. We know that he fought once against Manuel Rufino dos Santos. He lost. The fight was Samuel, the capoeira. There's no records of that fight ever taking place. It's all based off Carlos's testimony. If there is something, I'd love to see it. And the three matches with Gio Mori, one was admittedly a demonstration. The other two were very, very likely fake. Everything seems to indicate that they were fake matches. So he was not an experienced or good fighter for that matter. Like, it's very clear. George is the one who's going to step up and be that first Gracie superhero. Like, this is the first champion of the family at a time where Helio, you know, he's a swimmer then. Like, he was not, Jiu-Jitsu was not, he was only, Jiu-Jitsu will be a part of his life only later on, right? But George was part of arguably the first MMA fight in modern history, right? Or Valendo Tudo, as they called it then. He did a fight between him and Chico Soledade where they full on, like, you know, no gi, speedos, elbows, headbutts, the whole deal. You do whatever you want to do. I'm gonna do whatever I want to do. And he fights Chico Soledade. He wins that fight. So in some ways, he could be considered a modern father. You know, certainly not the only one, but a modern father of MMA, of the UFC. You know, and so he is very important for these reasons. He does spread jiu-jitsu around Brazil. He didn't sit still. You know, he was every couple of years he'd be somewhere else, bounced around a lot. He had children, but none of them really stuck to jiu-jitsu. He was not considered. He was not worried about lineages and a legacy. He was a very normal guy. From all accounts, he was a very normal person. He liked to drink. He liked to party. He was a womanizer. He's funny. He's charismatic. He didn't follow diets. He thought that people, my guess, I don't know this. My guess, he thought his mind was like, the Gracie diet is stupid. I'm not following this. And whenever Carlos, you know, would talk about, you know, the supernatural with him and like, follow my guidelines so you can become spiritual and enlightened like me, he probably thought his brother was full of it. You know, like that's I don't know this, but my guess was that George was that kind of guy. He's listening to Carlos and going, "You're full of it." Like, no, I don't buy any of this. Goodbye. I'm going to go to the beach and, you know, hang out with my friends. He was like a very normal person, and that's why he's not remembered. History does not remember normal people. Like, you have to be a very ambitious, somewhat vain, you know, self-centered individual to be remembered in history. Like, it's not, you see, and that's kind of like almost a norm. There are exceptions, of course. There are people that achieve, you know, do amazing things, but for the most part, you know, history remembers the hustlers, and George wasn't one. And I think that's not, and I think that's a quality of George. I really enjoyed George's figure because there's an article in the 1940s that he goes to the press and says, "Look, all these fights you guys are paying for, they're all fake." And then it was like, "Really?" It's like, "Yours too?" Like, yeah. My fight's pretty much all fake, man. We're just arranging. Oh, you know, like, everyone is doing fake fights. It was like everyone except my brother Helio. My brother Helio never done a fake fight. And this, to me, like, it makes me like him more. And I'll tell you why. Because he is shooting himself in the foot by admitting that most of his fights and most of his glory and most of his victories were fake. It takes a lot of courage, in my view. A lot of honesty and a lot of courage. And at the same time, he praises his younger brother, Helio, who was not in good terms with. Now, normally, if we give an interview, we're going to praise someone, we want to praise our allies. We don't praise our enemies in a very fragile moment like that. He's in a very fragile moment. He's exposing himself to the press, basically saying, "Look, most of my fights were fake." But not that brother over there, that guy who I don't even talk to. Well, his are real. Like, I got to give credit for that. And to me, that's the kind of character that I admire in history, because he had everything to lose from that and nothing to gain. And yet he did it because his conscience spoke to him and said, "No, you got to praise your brother, because it will be incorrect to leave him out if you believe that all of his fights were actually real." So I can't see Carlos and Helio doing returning the favor to George. I can't see that. I could see George doing that for Carlos and Helio. I don't see Carlos and Helio doing the same if the shoe were on the other foot. And that's why, to me, George is an irrelevant character. Not irrelevant, not just because he was part of the history, but I think his personality is in direct contrast to that of Carlos and Helio in many, many ways. And that's why we wanted to make an effort to remember him. Takeo Yano, the Ono brothers, Jacinto Ferro, obviously, he is the link between Maeda and Carlos. If there is a link, and there very likely is, but it's through Jacinto Ferro and not directly Carlos to Maeda. So that frame, those pictures on the wall in gyms, if you guys want to be accurate, you guys are going to have to change that. Unfortunately, there's only one picture of Jacinto Ferro, and it's not a great one. He's got a really big mustache, and he's lifting weights over his head here. It's not a great picture. But, you know, if you want to be accurate about it, like, that would be a more precise, you know, if you're going to stick to that lineage that we were discussing earlier, that would be the correct one, right? And then we have Donato Pires dos Reis, who very likely belongs there as well, because there's very clearly a seniority between Donato and Carlos. They were likely training partners, but at the same time, you know, Donato seemed to outrank Carlos because of how they interact, you know, the means by which they interact, right? Donato invites him to be his assistant instructor in 1928 in Belo Horizonte for the police in Minas Gerais. In 1930, they found the Jiu-Jitsu Academy, right? Carlos Gracie is an assistant instructor to Donato. Now, that could be either because of hierarchy, right? Donato trained longer and was better than Carlos. Could be because of money, too. You got to keep that in mind. Donato might have been footing the bill, so that's why he goes, okay, if I'm going to pay for everything, I'm going to be in the middle of the picture. I'm the director. I'm the boss. You're under me. So just because he's in the center of everything does not mean that Donato was necessarily better than Carlos. We don't know that, or outranked him, or was more knowledgeable, right? But there seemed to be a hierarchy, but there might have been a financial element into that hierarchy as well. You know, there's very likely Carlos learned from Gio Mori as well. You know, like it was the fight, the idea that Carlos would beat Gio Mori to me is ludicrous. You know, Gio Mori was a Kodokan black belt with international experience, like, you know, similar to Maeda. He traveled the world fighting before he makes, you know, settles in Brazil. He gets to Brazil. He has some professional fights in the circus. He barely speaks Portuguese. He doesn't know anyone. He's struggling like everyone else. And then one day comes Gaston Gracie, Carlos's father. They sit down with Gio Mori and go, hey, listen, hey, how about this? I'm a circus owner. I'm a fight manager. I've owned a brothel. I know business. Not in these words, obviously, but this is like the conversation. It's like, I know how to make money. Let's do this. Let's set up 2 fake fights. We'll build up, we'll be draws, and we'll build up momentum for a third one. We're going to make a ton of money. Are you down? And Gio Mori goes, why not? Of course, I need the money. So, you know, you got to remember, this is 1929, they fight, and then 1930 again. Carlos had not trained since Belém do Pará. Not that we know of. If Carlos was training somewhere else, he never said it, which is, you know, to me, suggestive that he really didn't, because if he did, he would have been very vocal about it, right? Is it possible that he was training through like early 1920s all the way to 1929, period of more or less 8-9 years? Was he training? My suspicion is that he wasn't, because he never, you know, there's nothing to back it up, and he never even said it. So imagine you're not training for 8-9 years, and you show up in Sao Paulo, the epicenter of Japanese immigration. You have all these judo and jiu-jitsu masters there, and you have Gio Mori, who's the most popular out of all of them, and you're going to have fights with him, and you're going to beat him after not training for 8-9 years, a Kodokan black belt with international experience? No way. And to add to that, about a year, in a previous interview, I had said a few weeks. It's not a few weeks. It's actually, I checked almost a year later, or actually it was more than a year later. Carlos and Gio Mori are in Rio de Janeiro. Carlos acting as manager of Gio Mori for a fight against Manuel Fernandez. So how can you guys be enemies in Sao Paulo and friends in Rio de Janeiro? Clearly, they weren't enemies, right? A few years after that, Gio Mori goes to the press and he spills the beans, and he goes, listen, those fights were fake. Carlos's father approached me and basically said, we will make more money if we fix the fights. So I went with it. Right. So Gio Mori is another character I fell in love with, because you can see the honesty hurts him, right? But he didn't want to come. He didn't want to be let history be told incorrectly. And because like a news article like that one has been buried for up to recently, like we just wanted to make an effort to bring it to light, and then people can draw their own conclusions. You can look at the primary sources and you can interpret this information differently. Maybe someone will find something tomorrow that disproves, you know, my interpretation of this is going to go, no, those matches were legitimate. Everything we have point to them being fake matches, right? Which does not discredit Carlos. It's just, and that's, you know, it's he kept it to himself. He was not George. George is like, no, I'm going to tell the truth, right? Like Carlos was, he had a bigger concern for legacy and history and his reputation than other characters did. And, you know, people can interpret that any way they want.
That's fascinating stuff, and I really do think I'm grateful to you for telling the untold story, particularly of Japanese immigrants to Brazil, because not just Gio Mori, but the Onos, you know, really, really fascinating stuff there. I want to switch gears, and we're getting some questions in the comments that I'll get to in a second. But like, what do we know about women training at that time? Because when I talked to Tufi, the earliest woman that he could find record of, at least at the time, and I don't want to say that you know, he may have found something since then, was Rosalina Coelho de Lisboa, who is a Portuguese-born Brazilian sort of feminist with fascist leanings, who like presumably trained with Carlos a bit. Were women training at that time? Do we know how many? Because like later, when the Gracies end up in legal trouble under the Vargas administration, Berta Lutz, another prominent Brazilian feminist, and Lisboa sort of go to bat for them. And so I'm wondering, were women training actively at the time that you know? What was the tenor of that in Brazil at the time?
When the original like boom or craze, as Pedro calls them, happened early in the 20th century, and these women and these Japanese are teaching all over the world. Women were a primary target. So like this doesn't start in Brazil. That like feminists learning how to defend themselves. This is like the early days of the feminist movement, right? So they look at jiu-jitsu as a means of empowering themselves. This is not new, right? So I mean, what better marketing tool of the weak defeating the strong than a woman throwing a man? I can't think of a better one other than a toddler doing it, right? Which is not mechanically viable. Like women are weaker. Like, who are we kidding? If they can throw a man, this stuff must really works. So, I know we know that women were trained at Gracie Academy. I didn't know this. I learned this recently. They had two different floors, one for women, one for men. They did not train together. Like it was separate. And the gym operated mostly under a private format. There were no group classes. So the women were, taking privates from the instructor. I wouldn't know much about, honestly. I know that there were women trained. I wouldn't know how many or how popular the classes were or who taught them and what was being taught. I imagine it'd be very self-defense oriented. But I wouldn't know details. I tried to stick to, there's a lot of pieces in this history that I'll be honest with you, I never really dug in too deep. To me, I really try to focus on the ones that I believe were most relevant to how BJJ developed out of judo. That's where much of my thinking and much of the research went into, because to me, that was the most relevant piece of everything. Like everything's kind of trickled down after that. Once we understand how BJJ and judo become different martial arts, everything kind of like, begins to fall into place, and from my understanding. But I know that there were women training. I know that, but again, like that was not something unusual. That was not unique to Brazil. Like I said, early in the 20th century, we have like plenty of pictures of women practicing what they called Jujitsu at the time. And it was basically, self-defense techniques.
Question in the comments from Hamid, relevant to the topic of how does Jiu-Jitsu evolve out of judo. Is it a myth that Maeda was removed from the Kodokan for prize fighting? Because we know there was tension between Kano and Maeda over prize fighting, but this is something that we're told, and I'm wondering if that's verifiable.
I remember hearing about this. I don't believe it. Like honestly, I don't want to say it was or it's true or not true, because I don't trust my memory on this. We visited the home where can you hear me? By the way, it's very windy.
Yeah, absolutely. We can hear you great.
So we visited the home where a home that he built and in which he died and in which his daughter still lived. She was very old, but like it was an adopted daughter. So she's an adopted child, but she's the heir to Maeda. And we really wanted to talk to her, but she wouldn't talk to us. We were there knocking at the door and we're at the house where Maeda, the house that he built and where he died. And his daughter's upstairs, and we're just like, please talk to us. I just want to, and it's not his biological daughter once again, but still, we really wanted to, meet her. And she was like, had a headache. We spoke to her husband, and he was somewhat friendlier, but not too friendly. Apparently that happens a lot where people knock on their door trying to talk about Maeda, and they're like, leave us alone. But they showed us some pictures. He has some Kodokan diplomas that I was like, would you? I didn't say it. I would have been out of place, but I wanted to buy them. I'm like, would you sell me those? He had some diplomas of Maeda being ranked, right? So they would over the mail, they were ranking Maeda, even though he was living in Brazil. He never would return to Japan. He was still being ranked, which suggests to me that he was never kicked out of the Kodokan, right? Because I did see those ranks. Now, was he kicked out in a later period? From memory, he wasn't. But I don't want to say for sure because I could be wrong. That might have, but I remember hearing about that. There has been talk about that over. The thing is, like, in the last 3 years, I've spoken to so many people, knowledgeable and unknowledgeable, sometimes you got to be careful so the information doesn't get convoluted in your head. So I'd rather not say anything unless I'm certain, because I know at some point will be used against me. And the bad thing about this is that if you're wrong about one thing, a lot of the things that you were right about will be discredited immediately, right? If the one thing you're wrong about is exposed. So you got to be, tread carefully. From memory, I want to say no, because I did see those diplomas. They were absolutely beautiful. I think I have pictures of them somewhere. And yeah, I really wish I saw some original photos of Maeda, pictures that are all over the internet that the family still held. There were the originals from the 30s and 40s of Maeda. So there was a very rich history there, but there's only so much we can put on the film.
Totally. And so if the in that spirit, if the answer to this is we didn't look into it, just let me know. But I'm curious if you looked into the role of capoeira at that time, because before judo sort of explodes and jiu-jitsu sort of explodes, capoeira is a popular Brazilian art. And Ciriaco, a capoeira fighter, fights Sadamiaco in 1909, a match that he wins, and it's sort of like there's this almost nationalistic upwelling of like, yeah, capoeira is our art. And then jiu-jitsu fighters start to beat capoeira fighters, and Brazilian jiu-jitsu sort of takes over. But I always think of like a thought experiment of like, what if Ciriaco won some of those fights against jiu-jitsu guys? Would we all be doing capoeira today? And
yeah, so yeah, that fight was an important one. There's a really cool cartoon about it. I don't know if you've seen it. If you haven't, just remind me and I'll send it to you later. Because Sadamiaco is the first representative of jiu-jitsu that we can verify. There are other accounts, oral accounts of other Japanese. There's one of a man called Takezawa Manji, who was allegedly hired by the Brazilian Emperor Dom Pedro II to teach the Brazilian Imperial Army, right? So this is in 1888, right? He was a circus traveler. We know that he was a circus traveler. We know that. Whether he taught martial arts or not is a different story. But that we know of and we can verify Sadamiaco. And he was not Kodokan. Interesting. He was from like one of those traditional schools in Japan. He was not a Kodokan practitioner. And Miyako does get into a fight with Ciriaco, right? And Ciriaco knocks him out. Knocks him out. And that's the first time the press in Brazil was really like speaking of jiu-jitsu. And it's a huge nationalist victory for Brazil because capoeira was seen as the national art. They just saw it Brazil versus Japan more than jiu-jitsu versus capoeira, right? And Sadamiaco stays in Brazil. He goes on to become a reporter. There's some really cool interest. There's a research that Marcial Serrano does on Sadamiaco's life. He changes his name. It was very hard to find. Becomes a reporter in São Paulo. He just revamps his life completely. And but he's a very present member in the Japanese community in São Paulo later in his life, but less involved in martial arts, but still he stays within Brazilian society. And but he loses that fight. Yeah, it's hard to say what would have happened. Like capoeira had its moments in Brazilian the history of martial arts in Brazil. There's this one researcher, I forgot his name now. I have his book, and he's sort of like the dean of the history of capoeira in Brazil.
Wow. And
we were going to interview him, and like a lot of people were insisting that we interview him because the history of Brazilian jiu-jitsu and the history of capoeira intertwine a lot during this period. Later on, less so, but during this period, they're fighting each other all the time. But I figured we weren't going to be able to fit it. Even though I would love to meet him and talk to him and interview him, I don't think it would have fit in the documentary. We were already, as is, leaving too much out. There's so much that we would like to add that we're not going to be able to. But capoeira is important. There's a man in 1913 called Mario Aleixo who allegedly learned jiu-jitsu from Sadamiaco, and he knew capoeira as well. And he creates a hybrid system of combat that is a precursor to MMA, really, when you think about it, because he is blending in the strikes with the takedowns with grappling. This is in 1913, a year prior to Maeda arriving in Brazil. Maeda doesn't make Brazil until 1914. So just give an idea how the ball was already rolling. Maeda doesn't start anything. He adds the momentum of something that was already ongoing. There's another article we found, another Japanese. If Sada is the first, then he's the second. If Manji is the first, then this man will be the third. But it's a man called Takaharu Saigo. Now, I take a little pride in this one because I'm like largely responsible for this one. But Takaharu Saigo was the grandson of Takamori Saigo. Takamori Saigo, for those more familiar with Japanese history, he's the last samurai. So if you watch the movie, Tom Cruise is a fictitious character. Takamori is not. Takamori is a legitimate historical figure in Japanese history. And when he got in Brazil in 1921, I believe, might have been 22, he claimed to be the grandson of the last samurai. And apparently no one paid attention. And, we saw that and we're going, oh, maybe he's telling the truth. Why would he lie? In the Brazilian press, you got to remember, no one knew who the last samurai was in Brazil. No one knew anything about Takamori Saigo until the movie came out, really. That's when like, oh, okay, now we know who he is. But if you know Japanese history, you know who he is. But for most people in the West, they wouldn't know. Certainly not in Brazil in the 1920s. So no one ever paid any attention. So we began digging. We found a Japanese. His name is Kenjiro. I can't remember his full name. We just called him Ken. And he helped us a lot. So I really got to give him most of the credit here. But we're like, hey, man, how about we try to find this man's family in Kyoto? You think we can do it? So he began digging and we exchanged tons of emails. And we found his family. And they had the family tree. They had pictures. And it's true. Takaharu Saigo, that was teaching in Sao Paulo in 1922, was the grandson of Takamori Saigo, the last samurai. So I thought that was pretty cool. That was our discovery. It doesn't necessarily change the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, but I thought it was a really, a cool piece of history that we're going to mention in the film. Just kind of like a side, story that we didn't really get into, but we did verify that indeed it was the grandson of the famed last samurai.
Super cool. And it sets up a sequel when you guys do a sequel in a couple of years. So
if anyone wants to donate a lot of money to us, then yes, we can do it, man.
I'll try and get rich so that I can do that.
It's crazy. Like we're talking, you have no idea how quickly money goes. When people told me how expensive it would be, I didn't believe them. But if you're going to do it right, it's going to cost a lot, man. And like every picture that we use has to be researched as to who owns it, getting rights for, like, it's every 3 seconds of the documentary is an uphill battle, put it that way.
Wow. Well, we're getting a bunch of comments in the comments about people who are really looking forward to seeing the documentary. Can't wait to see it when it comes out. Another question from the comments, and I've heard you address this in another interview, but what do we know about promotions from either Gio Omori or Maeda, either in Kodokan Judo or Jiu-Jitsu? Like, who do we know that they promoted? What can we verify for sure?
That's a good question. In fact, that was like one of the leading topics when we first started, is like who promoted, like we have red belts today. Okay, who promoted them and who promoted them? And that raises all these questions, right? And we do have a segment of interviews, and it's all in our transcripts then, we ask all the grandmasters and all the historians, like, who's promoting these people? And the answer is pretty much unanimous. It's either I don't know or they promoted themselves, right? Those are two answers. And like now today, like your reaction was the same reaction I had, and the reaction everyone's having who's watching this are going, what? They promoted themselves to black belt? I'm like, yeah, they did. And it sounds really shocking in today's context. You guys remember the black belt in the 21st century, and for most of the 20th century, it symbolized, or at least the second half of the 20th century, it's like that was your diploma. That's your PhD right there, right? So to say that someone gave themselves a PhD in something really is shocking. You got to understand what the belt meant at that period. A belt did not mean then what it means now. A belt, it didn't hold the weight. I'll give you an example. There's this article that I found in the Brazilian National Library where Maeda promotes 5 Brazilians. And the word he uses is primeiro galão. It's a very important article. And because I think it says something about the belt and its irrelevance at the time. Primeiro galão translates into first rank, more or less. I'm translating as best I can. First rank, right? Galão is like a patch of like military rank, right? That's a galão. So the reporter who's writing the article, he's using the best language he knows, but he doesn't black belt. What does that mean? We're talking 1921, 22 here. He hasn't in Belém do Pará. He has no idea what a black belt is, assuming it's a black belt. Now, here's a problem. In judo, traditionally, first can be it could be what we would call a brown belt today. It's first before it lasts, or it could be first degree. Remember, a judo black belt is a first degree black belt. He's not a black belt and then first degree. He's a first degree black belt, right? So the way they count things is a little bit different. And because of the language a reporter uses, we don't know if Maeda was promoting him the brown belts or a Q that would be the last Q before black, what we would today call a brown belt, not an actual brown belt, or to black belt / first degree as per Kodokan tradition. Could have been a hybrid system created by Maeda. We don't know that. My suspicion is that it was a black belt because of the time they had been trained. They've been trained approximately 5 years. And in Kodokan in those days, it was not unusual to promote someone, even under 5 years. That was pretty much the norm. So, now my suspicion is that Maeda promoted 5 Brazilians to black belt, either brown or black. My opinion, I think it's very likely black belt because of that time, right? And the fact that they were making a big deal out of it as well. But Guilherme de la Roque, Valdemar Gomes, Rafael Lopes, Mateus Pereira, Dr. Mateus Pereira, and Jacinto Ferro. Those 5 Brazilians are constantly mentioned in the press during this period, and Jacinto being the most prominent of all 5, but they're being promoted, right? And the fact that belt is never mentioned to me is suggestive. It didn't mean that much to them. Like, to them, it was more about certificate. Renato claimed to have a certificate from Konde Koma, Mitsui Maeda. He claimed to have it. And he talked about it nonstop. Every time he gave an interview, like, I am the only man in Brazil with a diploma, because the diploma actually meant more than the actual belt. Now, that's assuming he had a diploma. No one ever saw it. There's at least one reporter who claims to, the way he words it, makes it very clear that he saw a diploma. Now, what kind of diploma it was and what was in there, we don't know, right? Donato could have been perfectly just making it up, right? But he claimed to have a diploma that he was certified to teach. He was the only Brazilian certified to teach under Maeda, right? We don't know. We may never know. I doubt anyone's ever going to find a diploma. But it gives you an idea of how little the belt meant, right? But at some point, like, there's no way out of it. Everyone promoted themselves. It wasn't black belt at first. Like, when we spoke to João Alberto Barreto and Armando Vrede and some of the old timers, they said, like, the original instructors at the Gracie Academy, they wore a dark blue belt. It was a dark blue, and that was a rank. There was no other rank. Later, as judo becomes more popular, you got to remember BJJ models itself after judo. Judo is the most popular martial art on the planet. It is widely popular in Brazil. It's government supported. It has, it has a rank. It has tournaments. It has rules. As Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu distanced itself from judo, it distanced itself in terms of the rule set and much of the culture. It becomes very Brazilianized, but not so much in the sense where they're not going to follow a lot of the same protocols that judokas did. So the belt system is copied from judo. So later on, they show up with red belts at some point, and no one really knows who promoted them. And, they never were really. They promoted themselves. So you got to keep in mind that, it is easy for us to accuse them of being deceitful now, today, but you got to put it into context too. And at the time, who was going to promote it? Maeda never mentions Carlo or Helio by name. Maeda is Jacinto Ferro, to give you an idea of his position and standing with Maeda. He is mentioned in the press in the Amazon up to the 1970s. In the 70s, he was still referenced. This is like 40 years after he had died. He is still referenced as Maeda's #1 student in the Amazon, just to give you an idea of how relevant and important this man was. You don't hear a word about Carlos or, Helio in relation to Maeda other than through Carlos himself, right? The only person that was qualified to comment and does comment is Donato Pires dos Reis, who categorically says that Carlos never met Maeda. Now, we're talking about an eyewitness here. This man was there. He did say this at a time where he was enemies with Carlos. So he could have been lying to discredit Carlos and hurt him, right? But that's the only eyewitness we have suggests that Carlos never even met Maeda. So how could he ever have promoted him, right? Now, you could make a case that perhaps Gio Mori had promoted Carlos. I was like, that was they were friends for a good while. But Carlos never made that claim, either because that would contradict his story of being under Maeda, or because, he never did promote. Like Joe Mori never promoted Carlos, and that's why Carlos never said it. And this didn't become relevant until much, much later. But at the time they did it, no one questioned them. They were acknowledged in the press as jiu-jitsu masters. They felt they were jiu-jitsu masters. They were fighting. They had students. So one day they just copied the judokas and ranked themselves, And if you really want to get down to this, who promoted Jigoro Kano?
Yeah,
Who promoted Jigoro Kano? So,
I don't have an answer for you.
I don't either. So my point is, it's, I'm not saying that was, that there was no options for them, like that's the only thing they could have done. but let's not be too quick to judge. You know, I think it's easy to look back and say, like just I made this example. Yeah, sure. You did, if you read Tufi's dissertation, you saw that Helio was a member of the fascist party in Brazil, right? And like, what? Helio was a fascist? And I'm like, yeah. And I'm not saying I would have been a member of the fascist party. I can't see myself doing that in any period in history. But at the time in the 1930s, that was a very popular position to take, not only in Brazil, but also through much of Western Europe and including the United States. Henry Ford was a huge admirer of fascism. Hitler was on the cover of Times Magazine in 1933 as Man of the Year. The American press is praising Hitler as Man of the Year. Think about that. So for Helio, like, it's easy to look back and accuse these guys of being monsters for positions that we abhor in the 21st century, but at the time were commonplace.
Yes.
So, I got to be very careful when judging, from a distance, because it's not exactly fair with the participants.
This is one of the reasons that I'm so grateful for Tufi's dissertation and for your historian's approach to this documentary, because everything is context, right? And Tufi's dissertation, which I encourage everybody to read, not everybody loves to read academic papers, but the information there is spectacular and so rich and nuanced and multifaceted. Like, one of the things we talked about that I asked him about was, why did Berta Lutz and Rosalina Coelho de Lisboa, prominent feminists, why did they defend the Gracies for getting in a street fight when no one would accuse Elio of being a feminist, and said a lot of things that were super sexist for most of his life? And Tufi's like, well, you got to understand the context at the time. And because class rolls into it too. Like, a lot of the Gracie students were politically connected. Then you get into the Estado Novo. And this is what I don't know if you covered this in the documentary, because it's later than the origin, but the period where Hobson and Carlson get arrested for essentially going to what we would call a socialist meeting. And then most of the family is on the other side, but Elio was able to get Hobson, with the help of Elio Vigio, was able to get Hobson out of jail. So, it's tough. Like which is a long rant, but all this stuff is complex, right?
It's complex, and people's affiliations changes over time too. You got to remember, no one remains. Your positions are not the same throughout your life. I think a lot of people get flack for changing positions, but don't we all?
Yeah.
You believe in the same things you believed in as a child. On your deathbed, are you going to believe in the exact same things? I think very few people can say that. It's interesting because, they're the Brazilian, the Gracie family is associated with the Vargas administration, right? They have their connections with the Vargas. It's a dictatorship. Later, he is, he's elected president. He's a very complex and controversial figure, but they have their links to Vargas. Later, the Brazilian dictation, coup of 1964, already within a Cold War context. Vargas is within a Cold War context, but a very different one. It's not. He's a populist of the anti-communist sort, whereas the ones that would come later in Latin American history, they were either populists of a more of a communist leaning orientation, or they're going to be the military that are just going to be kicking everyone in the teeth, left, right, and center, of the Pinochet style, right? And the dictators that would come after 64 were more of the Pinochet style, even though not as violent in comparison. But the Gracies, like they don't have the association with that time, with those military. The association was more with the Vargas administration in the 1940s. During this period, like there's they do have connections, but they're not, like, judo is the big martial art. Like, jiu-jitsu is no longer in vogue in the 1960s and 70s. It's not. The Gracie family there's not much going on for them. Like, the 1940s was sort of like their big moment. Up to the fight with Kimura, Helio has his big moment, and after that they kind of die a little bit in the press, and there's not a whole bunch going on, right? Helio is older now. Carlos is much older. Like, Carlson kind of takes the forefront of the Vale Tudo movement, but it's still the heydays were behind them. But they have a complex relationship with Brazilian politics. Hobson is an enemy of the dictatorship during this time, which is ironic because in a more recent election in Brazil, he became a supporter of Bolsonaro, who is directly aligned with that same military orientation. So he was persecuted by them, and now he's supporting that same sort of line of political thinking. I don't know. He got older. He changed his views. some game there, maybe, you know, like, that Renzo had ties with the Brazilian Workers' Party. And I know this for a fact. I was in the UAE when he was there with the vice president lobbying for the Brazilian oil company. And then later, he supported Bolsonaro, and Bolsonaro's the one that's making like, that's, reaching out to the UAE for a partnership. And Renzo's the middle of all of it. So maybe there's some gain there as well to be had by Renzo, his father. It's hard to say. Hobson was one of my favorite characters to speak to, given he was so charismatic. Like, he was very hard not to like him, even though you can see he's a nutcase. But at the same time, he was you couldn't stop talking to the man. Like, he just had this charisma about him, like he. I remember, like, he would just like we went to eat afterwards, right? So we interview him. Lots of stories. He's a great storyteller. And we go to eat at a local restaurant after the interview, and we end up sitting down with him for 3 hours, and we can't stop picking his brain. And like, the waitress would come over, and he's like 88, 89, and he's hitting on the waitress, and I'm just listening. And we're talking game here, man. Like, red belt level game. We're not just talking like average pickup here. He was good at it, and I'm just listening. I'm like, God damn, I got to learn something from this guy.
We're gonna bring Hobson in for a seminar, guys.
Yeah, no, a seminar on pickup. He was smooth, man, and I was just like listening to him, and he was a phenomenal storyteller, very poetic. I'm like, did he memorize all those lines, or is he actually speaking from the heart? Because he had a knack for poetry, like when he spoke. And it was very endearing to talk to him. And he does get into the politics a little bit. He tells us of an episode of when he was dealing with the Brazilian dictatorship, and he was arrested, and his relationship to Brizola, who was a very important a politician in Brazil who later flees to Uruguay, and how it's, I don't want to mention this here, but like, he told us a lot about that episode that it wasn't off. I'd rather not comment, but history changing far beyond BJJ. History change in terms of Brazilian politics and its relation to the Cold War. Very, very interesting stuff. And at one point, because I had asked all the grandmasters, right, because to me, I see these red belts in their 80s and 90s, and I see myself in the future. Like, that's me 40 years down the road, right? Who am I going to be? Am I going to be more like this guy, Armando? Am I going to be more like João Alberto? Am I going to be more like Hobson? Like, where do I fit in within the grandmasters of jiu-jitsu? Because they are me in the future, all of us. So I'm asking for life advice. What's life all about? Like, a very off camera, nothing to do with jiu-jitsu. It was just my own personal, like, I want to pick this man. There's a lot of wisdom here. These men have gone through life, and they all had a very positive outlook, which was one of my favorite things about interacting with them, is that they were very positive about life in the world, regardless of, they were not grumpy. They were happy. They were optimistic, almost the youthful optimism about life in general. So I appreciated that. And I was asking all of them for life advice. And most of them, or all of them really, were giving you the standard answers. Like, spend more time with family, like the little things in life, and, be around good people, and do what you love, and follow your heart, and don't be obsessed with money and proving yourself to other people. It was all the typical advice that anyone that is full of wisdom would give you. And I'm like, thank you. You're just confirming, what I thought I knew. And I just wanted to hear it from you guys directly. And I thought that was very good advice. And then I asked Hobson, give me some life advice. And Hobson goes like this. Because he's telling me like all his stories of his youth and the crazy stuff he had done. And like, listening to the man, and it's a miracle he's alive. Like, he was a very, very, very brave, very courageous, very outgoing, so to speak, like not scared of like, being reckless. And that's exactly how he described life. He goes like, in life, you have to be inconsequential or reckless, depending on how you want to translate it. Like, you have to live life as irresponsibly. Like, that was his advice to me. Live life irresponsibly. Not in those words. I'm just trying to translate it from his best. But reckless, inconsequential, irresponsibly. And he was serious. Like, he wasn't joking. He wasn't trying to be funny. He's like, in life, you have to live life irresponsibly. And I understood what he was saying, because when there's responsibility, there's less life. Right? Like,
Truth.
I'm recently reading Shakespeare's Hamlet, and there's a part in it, he goes like this: consciousness makes a coward of us all.
Wow.
I love that. You know, I thought it was very, very powerful, and it reminded me of Hobson, because Hobson is speaking to that. If you think too much and you're too consequential, you're going to become a coward. And if you're a coward, you didn't live. And when I recall my best moments in life in Jiu-Jitsu, and Jiu-Jitsu itself, it was a very reckless moment for me, because I was in my teens, and most people in their teens are worried about what they're going to do with their lives and work and school and making money. And I was like, F it, I'm just going to do Jiu-Jitsu. It was reckless, you know, but it worked in my favor. And sometimes it doesn't. But I think that's what Hobson was speaking about. And even though it sounds irresponsible, it was very wise at the same time, because if you're too responsible, you don't live. For life to take place in a meaningful way, I think there has to be a level of irresponsibility and courage in the Shakespearean sense of the word, you know, like not become a coward by overthinking everything, you know, like not planning your trips too much. It kills the fun. It kills the fun if you plan every second of a voyage. You have to throw yourself out there, backpack, ask for information, get lost, figure things out, you know, like live, man, like that. And that's what I got from Hobson. And after hearing all his stories, it wasn't lip service. Like that's how he lived his life. It was, and he even says it, like, I never thought I'd be the patriarch of the Gracie family. I never thought I'd make it this far. Like he was shocked that he was still alive, you know. And that's why it was so entertaining to speak to him, because it was very genuine. Like he was truly amazed that he had lived that far in life. And he gave us some amazing sound bites for the documentary. Like some of them we're not going to be able to use because, you know, it just doesn't fit. But, you know, like he has a very poetic mind, so to speak. So very, very interesting character.
I'm super jealous. Hobson is one of the Gracies that I've always been most fascinated with, and it sounds like he lives up to expectations and beyond. Can we talk about Elio's two most famous fights? Because you know, Elio, you know, everybody knows about the fight with Kimura, Masahiko Kimura, who I want to talk to you about. But before that, Kimura makes him fight Yukio Kano, and he ends up cross-choking him, which is probably Elio's signature win, like most important fight that he won, I would say. What do people not know about those fights that they should know?
Very good questions. I'm going to just like mention two other fights that to me are far more important, even though they're not as famous. They're not popular. Most people have never heard of them. But the two matches between Helio and Ono, Yasuichi Ono. And to me, those matches are the definition of the split between Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and Judo. Because at that moment, they could no longer agree on the rule set. That's where the split takes place. Because they couldn't agree on the gis. You got to remember that. The Japanese were more willing to fight. Like Helio and Carlos, like to quote Pedrera, they were more Japanese than the Japanese. You know, like the Japanese, like Joe Mori would take his gi off and like, I'll fight no gi. Maeda did the same. Carlos and Helio, no, only gi. And it has to be short sleeves, no long sleeves. Because the sleeves would give the Japanese an advantage in throwing, right? So they're very picky about how they fight the Japanese. And Ono is just like, he wants a piece of Helio so bad. He agrees to all of Helio's demands and he goes, let's do this. Okay, no points. All right. No, I know long fights. I think it was like 100 minutes. I think it was like a long fight, you know. And Ono agrees to it. He's like, let's go. And in both instances, Ono, I think the first time he takes Helio down 32 times. And the second fight, 27. I think Helio got Ono down once each from memory, right? So clearly Ono wins, but he can't finish Helio because there are no points. And now it's like, so I think, well, I drew with the Japanese. That's a huge victory not getting topped by Ono because Ono really was better, you know, and there's no way out of that. But during that moment, that fight right there defines the split because from that moment onwards, because the third time, they're going to fight a third time, and Ono goes, okay, we drew twice, even though, you know, technically Ono really wins. But he goes, let's go with points now. Internationally accepted rules with points. Helio won't fight him. He suggests Carlson Gracie instead, right? Never happened, but it would have been interesting to see Carlson Gracie versus Yasuichi Ono. But to me, that fight, those two matches are far more important than the one with Valdemar Santana, which everyone always references, which speaks volumes as to Helio's cojones. Yeah. You got to give Helio a lot of credit with that fight with Valdemar Santana because he took that fight with a week notice. He was in his early 40s, if memory serves me. And he's fighting a man in his, like, I can't remember his age, but not only was Valdemar heavier, He was in his mid-20s, maybe late 20s, so he's a lot younger than Helio. And Helio took the fight like it was out of honor. And he got killed in that fight, really. But you got to give him some credit for, I don't know if I would take a fight against someone 15 years younger than me with a week notice, heavier, and as athletic as Valdemar Santana was. So Helio, for all his flaws, like he was a tough bastard. Like no one can take that away from him. You know,
For sure.
His actions were his words were, you know, and that's not something that a lot of people have. Like most black belts don't have that sort of courage. So you got to give him credit for that. At any rate, he didn't win that fight and wasn't even close. He got beat up the whole time. He gets soccer kicked at the end and, you know, knocked out. And I don't think there's any shame in losing to Valdemar, but he didn't prove his point. I'll fight you. I think his point was proved. But the fight with Kimura, you know, it was used as a huge piece of marketing, right? Because you know, Kimura took like X amount of time to finish Helio when in fact Helio, he was really very defensive the whole time. And Kimura complains. He never praises Helio. That's not true. He complains that Helio was basically trying to survive the whole time. And had Helio opened up more, he would have finished him sooner, right? But the match with Kato is also incorrect. Kato was not vice champion of the world. Neither was Kimura champion of the world. There was no world championship at the time. Kato was a junior member of the crew between Yamaguchi and Kimura and Kato. Kato was the youngest and least experienced. He was a junior member. They really thought Kato was going to beat Helio, but Helio defeating Kato really was a huge win. You can't take credit away. They fought twice, actually. They drew the first time. Helio wins the second by choke. And, you know, that's when Kimura decides to fight Helio. But, you know, Kato was not as skilled as they made him sound. Like, he was not vice champion. He was not a great, you know, he was a junior member of the crew. But just the fact that he was around Kimura, I think did say something. He was not a rookie either. So I think that is by far Helio's most significant accomplishment in his career is defeating Kato, in my opinion. Because you have someone that, even though probably was less experienced than Helio, young, you know, it's still someone that was training with Kimura. So that was significant. What else? Did I answer your question?
Absolutely. And I'm thank you. That's really excellent information. We have a question from the chat from Elias who asks, because you mentioned, you know, that they were arguing about gis, particular rule sets, and just a general question that maybe you can apply to specific situations, which is, why is no gi looked down upon? Why is there such an emphasis in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in fighting with the gi on? And
I think it has to do with, I think that as everyone will agree that from a business perspective, the uniform and the belts make a lot more sense. You know, there's something traditional about a gi and a uniform that make it more appealing to parents, and it makes it more appealing to women because there's a thick layer of cloth between my skin and yours. I think women are far more likely to adventure into training the gi than no gi, right? A lot of people are germophobic too, like sweat on sweat, like gi kind of creates that barrier. So I think that from a business perspective, I think that was the main factor that made gi the dominant uniform in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu over no-gi. And it's not because they didn't train no-gi. Most of these practitioners, Gio Mori took his gi off. George Gracie fought in catch wrestling rules. You know, so it wasn't like Maeda, same thing. He fought in catch wrestling rules when he was in England. So, you know, it wasn't that like they were unwilling to take their uniforms off. I think that from a business perspective, the gi made a lot more sense. And I think that what was true then is true now. You can talk to any business owner and they'll tell you that the gi program is more profitable. I have tried to make my program 50-50. The gi classes are always bigger. So I have to, you know, my program now is like 70-30, 70 gi, 30 no gi. But that is not it's not an arbitration. It's more a side effect, a reflex of the aspirations of my clientele. So I have to factor all these things in. And I think that is the main reason why. I don't think it's idealism. I think, to me personally, they're equally interesting. They're just as interesting, just as important. I highly recommend both. I will go to my grave defending that grapplers should train both gi and no gi. Even for self-defense purposes, you should train gi and no gi. You know, a lot of the arguments against the gi goes, well, no one's going to be walking around in a gi down the street, which is true. I've never seen that. I've also never seen anyone in spats. I've also never seen anyone with like a rash guard on, you know. If you're in board shorts and a t-shirt, that's much closer to no-gi. But depending on where you live, you may be wearing a jacket, you may be wearing a sweatshirt. You are wearing clothes, you know, no one walks around naked. You can grab a t-shirt. So, you know, the gi is not that removed from a real life situation like people make it sound, even though I would grant that no gi is closer to real combat than the gi is. It's not by that much. You know, most people are wearing clothes and often thick clothes. So there's that element to keep in mind. But as a practitioner, I strongly defend both. In fact, to me, it's double the fun. Like, I never understood people that only wanted to do one. It's like, it's double the fun. Like, why would you double the competition experience too? You know, and why would you want to, you know, it's like, I only read this kind of books, or I only read this author. Like, I don't get, like, what do you mean you don't want to read something that's a little bit different? You know, you want to expand. If there were a third option out there, you know, like, I want to try that too. Like, I'll try Sambo, just a jacket, just to see what kind of dynamics would develop from that. You know, like, I like to grapple in a wrestling format sometimes. No submissions, just wrestling. I have fun with it. I started in wrestling too late. I really wish I had wrestled as a child. I think I'd be a much better grappler had I wrestled as a child. You know, but, you know, I love wrestling as well. I would try catch wrestling rules. It looks interesting to me. So I don't know. I think that grappling is overall not so different. You know, like, we have far more similarities with wrestling and catch wrestling than differences. Like, just that we focus on the differences. We don't focus on the similarities, but it's all one thing, man. It's just really all one art, you know, under different rule sets. And I want to experiment with all of them and, you know, enjoy them all. And that's what I recommend my students and everyone else do.
One of the things my co-head instructor, Dave Porter, always says is, why would you rely on your self-defense based on what they might or might not be wearing? And one of our most popular classes, and when we do get you up here to do a film screening and a seminar, which we hope we'll do, we all hope the pandemic will end soon. One of the most popular things we do is a street clothes class, where we get and wash a bunch of Goodwill clothing. And we have had guys show up in business suits, and I grapple in a sweater vest last time, and it's incredible fun. It's super. Yeah. Would you do that with us when you come up?
I would 100%. In fact, I might steal that idea.
Please, by all means.
I would steal that idea from you too. And I love that, man. I think that's great. And it sounds like a lot of fun. When I started training, not directly related, but kind of related, when I started training my first gym in Brazil as a white belt, we had, like, once a month, we do what we call taparia, which means, like, slapping each other, more or less. And we'd take our jackets off, you know, just gi pants, shirt off, and we do jujitsu, but you could slap each other. The only rule is you couldn't slap people but you could slap them here and here. You could slap them in the neck and the body as hard as you want to do. And it was almost like MMA. We're just beating the crap out of each other, you know. You just protect the face. It was kind of like the rule we try to observe. Like, no shots to the groin, no biting, obviously, no hair pulling. But it was jiu-jitsu with slaps. And it was funny, man. Like, it's kind of, you know, reckless in the Hobson sense of the word, you know. But, man, it was fun. You know, good memories, man. We beat the crap out of each other. You go home and have, like, huge marks across your face, on your back, and it was just like, man, this is. And if it got too intense, like, someone would step in and stop it. No one got seriously hurt. But again, when you're like 17, you're just retarded, man. Like, everything is just fun. You know, I don't think I would want to do that now these days. But when you're young and really hungry for, like, jiu-jitsu and proving yourself on the mats, it was a blast.
It says a lot about me that at 45 years old, that still sounds fun to me. I'm not sure if that says great things about me, but
I don't know, man. Like, I don't know if I want to, like, see, depending on how people hit you, like, it hurt, like, in the head, like, it's like getting punched in the face, man. It's not fun. You just didn't get cut. That's the only difference, you know, and you could get hurt, man. Like, it's not safe, but again, you know, consciousness, cowardness, you know, like, you gotta tread that line of risk sometimes to be able to experience and enjoy life.
definitely. Hey, one other history question I want to make sure that I ask you, which is, do we know why Donato Pérez dos Reis fell out with the Gracies? You know, because they have this business relationship, and then there's a split, and I don't know much about if we know why that is or what happens after.
I don't know. I know that the Gracie brothers, according to Donato, not to any other sources other than Donato himself, attacked him in the America Hotel in Rio where Donato was living. So they physically attacked him. So that's not the first or second time where, you know, they're going to do that. That happened on at least 3 occasions, right? Where they're accused. And one time they were convicted. We spoke briefly of that episode. They were arrested for aggression against Manuel Rufino dos Santos, just outside Tijuca Tennis Club, where the World Championship, the Mundials of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu were held, ironically. Just outside of it, that's where they attacked the man. But, oh, shit, what was on that question? I went on a tangent. Sorry, refresh my memory.
Oh, no worries about why
Donato
Donato.
and the Gracies, yeah. So Donato, I've never seen why they specifically fought. I suspect now you get an alpha male type like Carlos, and then you get Donato, who's in charge of the club, probably owns the mats and probably owns the rents the building in his name, and so he's technically the boss. And I can see them clashing inside, like too many chefs in the kitchen. I think that there were rationales around that, but at the bottom of it, at the foundation of everything, you get two chefs in the kitchen, and Donato was outnumbered. George was there, and he probably felt that George could probably, George was younger, could probably beat him. Probably felt a little intimidated at some point, and he didn't need the money. He was a tax collector, worked for the government, so he had a good job. So to him, jiu-jitsu was a side job. It was like it was something he liked, not something he needed, or it was more of a means of living for Carlos and George, from my understanding. So I suspect that was it. It came down to money and who was the boss, and they're not there for very long. They're there for about a year, 2 years maybe, from memory. I can't remember the exact dates here, but then Donato does leave after he's attacked, and Carlos keeps the gym, and that's when he starts calling it the Gracie Academy. So much after that 1925 patch that I suspect, and I want to wager something with you, they're going to stop making that patch.
Really?
Sure. Oh, they're going to stop. It's a matter of time.
Because they can't defend the date?
They can't defend that date. And I think it's, my suspicion is right, they're going to start doing it very soon. That date is, they're going to stop insisting on that 1925 date. You're going to see the same logo, but you're going to stop seeing that 1925, because as the date becomes more and more known, as people know more about this history, they're not going to be able to back it up. And they don't even try, and they can't. They can't be done unless they find something, right? Unless they come up with something that, changes everything. It's highly unlikely. They're going to slowly, let's pretend we never used that date, because it clearly, now why they made that mistake, I don't know. We were talking to Pedro Valenti, and he suggested, maybe they were training there at home, and maybe they considered that to be a gym, and maybe in 1925 Carlos started teaching his brothers. It's possible, and we don't know. We can't say it was, but it's not totally unfeasible that they would roll on carpet. I've done that before. I didn't have mats. I'm rolling on carpet with my friends. We grapple on carpet. So it's not unrealistic that something like that could have taken place. But Marcial Serrano suggests that they pushed the date back to 1925 because they wanted to sound like pioneers, unaware of Mario Aleixo, perhaps unaware of Takaharu Saigo in Sao Paulo. They wanted to sound like pioneers of jiu-jitsu, so they stayed 1925. Could have been because Carlos, just his memory doesn't serve him well. People asked him, so when did you open that gym? And he goes, 1925. And then it stuck. 1925 becomes a date. It could be, it could be a variety of reasons. It could be an honest mistake, or it could be just them, like Marcial suggests, trying to sound like pioneers. But the date 1925, from what we know, given everything we do know, is absolutely incorrect. And even if Carlos were rolling with his brothers in his garage with carpet or whatever, even if he was teaching them, that's still not a gym. It's not an academy.
Yeah, Elias was asking in the chat earlier about a timeline for most of this stuff. And so Donato has the gym as of 1925, but the earliest that we would...
1930.
Sorry?
1930. There's no gym in 1925.
Oh, okay. I didn't realize that. I thought Donato had the gym.
Nothing in 1925, unless you assume that Carlos was training with his brothers at home, and you would assuming that is true. We don't know. There's no verifying that. I wouldn't consider that a gym.
Right.
The gym that we know was founded in September 1930 by Donato, and later 1932 would start being called the Gracie Academy.
Thanks for clearing that up. That's exactly what I was asking.
Yeah.
So man, I could seriously sit here and talk with Jiu-Jitsu history with you all day, and I will if you let me. But I also want to be respectful of your time. So
I got time. It's funny. I'm pausing. I got a couple calls here. I got some replies to some texts, and then I'm actually writing a book about the documentary. It's funny. Like I was talking to Pedro's one who suggested it, and he goes, why don't you write an article about your experience, making a documentary? I think you'd make some good content. I'm like, it's not a bad idea, man. I got some good stories. And the article quickly became a chapter. A chapter becomes two. I think I'll be at about like 60, 70,000 words by the time I'm done with this. So we should have like quite a, it's, you know, it's not going to be a huge read. It's going to have some historical relevance. I plan on using some material that's not going to be in the documentary, some side stories, some of the stories that I told you, some of my own interpretations. And I think I'll be able to finish before the documentary is finished. And yeah, I plan on releasing it soon. We're working on some other products for the documentary, not just a documentary, but we want to do a limited edition gi, maybe some posters, the book, maybe down the road a director's cut for the film, like with some extra content, you know, and you know, try to get people as informed as possible.
Yeah, man, I'm interested in all that stuff. So that's exciting. And like just hearing, not even hearing the stories, but just hearing the list of who you talked about, even a part of the Red Belts about who you interviewed. You interviewed, you know, Hobson and Pedro Valencia, who's I know you talked to Hoist Gracie. You know, that made me think of when you're talking about the Navy belts, which Hoist has gone back to as an instructor. And so just knowing the people that you talked to, I can only imagine the stories that those guys told you.
Yeah, man, we had, like, it's funny because honestly, I'll be completely honest with you, other than the historians and researchers, we knew way more about the Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu history than everyone else we interviewed. And it's not, you know, I don't want them to take this as an insult, but like they're just, for the most part, they're repeating what they were told. So the reason why we put a lot of these grandmasters and people like Hoist and Kira Gracie and you know, Mario Yamazaki, we interviewed Andre Pederneiras at some point, not because they were history experts, like we knew that they weren't, but they added an element that we thought was relevant. You know, a documentary, a film is not just about information. A documentary film, historical documentary film, it sits on the crossroads between information and entertainment, and there's an aesthetic value. There are other elements that are relevant in a film for it to be good. You know, you can't. If it were just me, I think it would be very, very informative, very, very boring. And then luckily we have a team of people that are wiser than me and more experienced, and they go, if you just do this, it's going to be boring. There has to have other elements so that the audience can relate to people, right? To the story. So that's why people like Andre Pederneiras, Mario Yamazaki, and Kira Gracie, for example, Hoist Gracie, they don't add anything to Jiu-Jitsu history. But they talk about their, like, Hoist and Kira obviously as members of the Gracie family. Hoist is, you know, Hoist is Hoist. Like, he's such an important figure in a later period of Jiu-Jitsu and the MMA boom around the world, that he adds a lot of value to our film. But it allows the audience, it allows the viewer to make a connection between the present and the past. Because if I just have newspaper articles, historians no one has ever seen or heard of, and old timers that no one has ever seen or heard of, the audience is going to have a hard time bridging that story to the present, we felt like. So there's a number of characters that we wanted to put there because they help the audience relate to the story. And they help color it. You know, like, people recognize Mario Yamazaki from the UFC. You know, Kira is not only the only woman we interview in the documentary. We did try to interview Hayla Gracie, Roger's mom. She wanted $250,000 to do it.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, she felt that we were rewriting her book, and she's going to sell us rights to her book. I'm like, we're not rewriting your book. We want to interview as someone who has researched Jiu-Jitsu history, and the daughter of Carlos Gracie. We felt she was very relevant. The fact that she's a woman helped us a lot too, because otherwise it was just going to be men, you know. And these days, I don't think that's important. It's information is all that matters, regardless of your gender. But in the current time, it's almost like expected to have this diversification. And I didn't want diversification to be at the cost of information. You know, I think that the priority has always been information over anything else. But, you know, we were expecting flack if we didn't have like any, like, not a single woman there. And Hayla was our first pick, and Kira was in there as well. But I think Kira was relevant as a competitor, as a member of the young generation that fans can relate to. So there was that element as well. Yeah, we try to meet somewhere in the middle. You know, we try to view. I think that what was originally reason for conflict in our production team, I think it's turned out to be a strength, because, you know, from these extremes, I think that what's going to come out is something that's both beautiful and highly informative.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it sounds like to me. And like, honestly, if you'd have made something that you described as your first impulse, your audience would be like me and 5 of my friends, because I'm the type of dude that will, consume all of that, you know, and I want the information. I'll read dissertations. I'll read, you know, I know some Japanese, so I'll read that stuff. And, you know, I loved Craze for just that reason. But like, you know, it's sort of like fighting itself, right? Where who is going to watch Hoist versus Dan Severn for like 30 minutes at a time when the public is largely uneducated about ground fighting? It looks like nothing's happening. A lot more people are going to watch modern UFC with rules and time limits and action things designed to press the action. And so you're going to have like the hardcores that will consume, because if you put out a director's cut, I'm watching that. If you know, your book, I'm getting it. But like for most folk that don't have this obsessive interest in jiu-jitsu, I do think it's important to have the more story elements, right? The because oral tradition is important too, right? Just because something, and you know, and this is just my opinion, but personally, I think partly what I'm excited about in your sort of historian's approach is verifying those oral tradition stories. Like, are these stories that we've been told, what's true? What do we know for sure is true? What do we think is true but can't prove? What are we suspicious about? What have we been told that's true that's probably not true? And stuff like that. Because if you are just sort of repeating the narrative that you've been told, nobody does that verification work.
Yeah, and you know, it's you got to understand, like, and not everyone thinks like me and you, Jeff. Like we have, you know, like I met so many people who bought Shocky, you know, but they couldn't finish it. Like, Rob, I can't finish it. I know so many, the majority of people I know who bought the book didn't finish it. And to me, it's like, no, man, push through it. You know, it's a great read. Like, it's so important. But it's not for everyone. Like, academic work is not meant for entertainment. It is not meant for aesthetic value. It is meant for information and education purposes. And, you know, I don't think that's boring, but most people disagree. I think I prefer nonfiction. I've always preferred that sort of work. Like, to me, literature is something I don't have to force myself to get into. I recently got back into it. But for the most part, I prefer nonfiction, you know, evidence-based. And I think that to me is more entertaining, in fact. But like, you know, we have to factor in that a film is, if the purpose of the film is to reach to a broader audience and re-educate the people on the history of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, then it's by definition, we have to, you know, accommodate to them, right? We can't, you know, just make a film for me, you, and the other 15 researchers around the world, you know, like I mean, that's, if it were just me, that's what I would end up doing.
Yeah.
I would end up doing something that, like, me, you know, Marcial, and then like 5 other historians in the world, Pedrero, are going to enjoy, like, oh, that was a great film. Everyone else is going to be like, what is this?
Yeah.
So
it's funny that you would mention that. It's funny you mentioned in the context of Shocky, because I like, so I prepared, because a lot of the students that are watching this are white belts that have just got into jiu-jitsu in the last year or two, and a lot of the folks watching the stream. So I wrote a blog post. It's like, hey guys, here's some things to get you ready for this live stream to like lay the framework for what we're going to be talking about. And so I broke it down into categories of really accessible, moderately accessible, not so accessible. And I had Shocky in the really accessible. No, you guys got to read this. And like one of my instructors were like, I don't know, like, pretty academic, man. And I was like, okay, you're probably right. But
because a story, when it's something told, like it follows a line and a train of thought you can relate to, and you fall in love with the characters, right? It's literature. And Shocky is cataloged. He's cataloging information. So there's no necessary connection between the facts. He's just dumping all the facts on you, like, year by year. And it's all relevant. And, you know, he draws like very important conclusions. And like, it's the book that inspired the film. And I do recommend everyone read it. But, you know, on the other hand, like, I understand it's not meant to be a fun read. Like, it's not its intention or purpose. And it never says it, but it makes it very obvious.
I think the real value of Shocky, and to a lesser extent, maybe not even to a lesser extent, but the value of it, like, is the original research material that he presents there. He's like, look at these contemporaneous newspaper accounts. This is what people were talking about. Here's some pictures, so that you can, you know, we can all interpret facts, but like a lot of those facts just weren't out in the public record. Like and same with a lot of the stuff that, again, I recommend everybody watching this follow Closed Guard on Instagram, because you'll come up with stuff that, you know, regularly, stuff that I have never seen before. You mentioned the cartoon of Siriaco, right? That's how I first became aware of that. And so and, you know, newspaper clippings of like George Gracie fights, or like the picture of Carlos with Joe Omori, right? Stuff that the public had never seen before. And so that I think,
We got a lot more, man. We're just like kind of holding on. Like we want to keep most of it for the documentary.
Of course.
So some really cool. We have a video of Osvaldo Fada. You've never seen a video of Osvaldo. Never one has ever seen a video of Osvaldo Fada. We have it. It was like quite a battle to get it from his family because they were holding on to it, like the treasure it is, you know. But we got a copy of it. We're going to use in the documentary.
Awesome.
People will see Osvaldo Fada teaching for the first time.
Oh, that's incredible. That's incredible because Fada's one of those crucially important figures that I think not enough people know about, and I've never seen anything like that. So I'm thrilled to look forward to that.
Yeah, I mean, everything is, we're touch on it as, you know, but we can't get too far down the rabbit hole with any of it because we only have 90 minutes, right? We're trying to cut it at 90 minutes. That's our goal.
Definitely. So I have a question for you that's it's not quite on topic, but from the Riddler in the chat, which is, what's your favorite martial arts film?
Film?
Yeah. I can tell you what he wants you to say.
I don't think I've ever seen a martial arts film that I really liked.
Wow.
I remember watching Bruce Lee and Van Damme as a child, and those were great, but now I watch them and they give me a headache. I did love the fight scene between Brad Pitt and Bruce Lee and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. To me, that was like, oh man, that scene is so good. Wouldn't call it a martial arts film, however. But I like Tarantino movies, minus the blood. But I can't think of anyone. Like I tried to get into John Wick, I couldn't. I can't get into martial arts films, man. Like I never, as a child, I liked Bruce Lee and Van Damme, like I mentioned, but I can't think of anyone that I felt really spoke to me and like I felt was I don't like movies. I'm very picky when it comes to movies, man. I have like 3-4 directors out there that I like, and you know, I have like very specific about my topics, but I don't. Yeah, sorry.
No worries. So about your film, like obviously we don't know when this crazy global pandemic is going to end, and we had on the calendar you to come out here in July. We rented the theater. Now obviously we don't know what's going to happen, whether stuff's going to start to open. But we've paid for the deposit for that, so like we will have that film, that theater whenever it is possible. And so I'm just curious, like what your current, like if there weren't a pandemic, like what do you think the timeline on the film is? Because I know you've had some delays.
Well, the pandemic's actually sped up the process. It actually worked in a favor. Just so you know, my battery's at 3%. So if something happens here, it's because my battery died. And maybe we'll make this the last question before I go. Not because I have to, because my battery's about to die. But the pandemic, believe it or not, has sped up the process because everyone's locked at home. There's not a whole bunch going on. So we we felt that it works in our favor because, you know, jiu-jitsu tournaments have stopped. Like there's no content out there outside of podcasts, really. There's nothing else going on. So it's a perfect time to release the film. And we're working really hard to release it this summer. Like we originally had April, and then the problem is like it's hard to put your finger on an ideal script. We've changed the script so many times, and it's constantly changing. We're readapting, and that's sort of like the whole back. But we're making a big push to finish this summer, and I really think that this film will be the archival film that tells the history of jiu-jitsu. The grandmasters are all dying. We've lost 4. We have lost Armando Vridit. We have lost Georges Midi. We have lost Antonio Vieira, died 2 days ago. He's the last living student of Luis França. And Murata from the Kodokan Museum, right? So George Midi, we didn't interview, but we do talk about him. So 4 grandmasters in a period of, like, just give an idea of how quickly we're losing these treasures of jiu-jitsu history. And, you know, we're privileged to have be able to spoke to them. Like, this won't be able to be redone because no one's going to be around. We're going to have people from a much younger generation that didn't even, they're going to have a less and less connection to this story, we feel like. So the more time goes on, the harder it was going to be to ever replicate what we're doing. So we're very, very proud of that. But because of this responsibility, right, we're aware that it has to be done right. And that takes, you know, we can't rush it.
Well, man, I want to thank you for 2 things. First of all, from a lover of jiu-jitsu's perspective, thank you so much for doing this work. It's great to see a credible one-stop shop for the history of how jiu-jitsu came to be. It's going to be amazing. Everybody's looking forward to checking it out. And second, thanks for taking the time to sit around and answer all our questions. And we're really looking forward to seeing the film when it comes out.
Thank you. And send me the link when you get a minute. And I appreciate the support, Jeff. And we'll meet up in person again soon enough, I'm sure. And for everyone else out there, stay healthy, and yeah, life goes on. Let's be strong.
Most definitely. I'll shoot you that link. Take care. We'll see you up here in Bellingham for a film screening sooner rather than later, I hope.